65 seconds. That is all it took. Thomas Massie walked into that hearing room with a calculator in one hand and a file in the other. Not a talking point, not a rehearsed speech, a calculator. And when people in the room saw it, nobody understood what it was for. A calculator in a congressional hearing. But Massie knew exactly what he was doing because numbers don't lie, and he was about to prove it. Let me tell you something about how Thomas Massie prepares for a hearing. He doesn't call consultants. He doesn't hire opposition researchers. He sits down with the raw data himself. State budget reports, annual audits, line-item expenditure tables, the documents that most politicians hand off to a staffer and never read. Massie reads every page. He was an electrical engineering student at NYT. He built circuits. He understands that every system has an input, an output, and an error margin. And when the error margin is $847 million, that is not a rounding mistake. That is a signal. He had spent 3 weeks preparing for this specific question. 3 weeks going through Florida Department of Justice financial records that most people in Washington had never touched. And what he found in those records was not a theory. It was arithmetic, the kind that doesn't care who you are or what office you hold. He walked into room 2141 of the House Judiciary Committee that morning, knowing exactly what Bondi would say at every stage. He had mapped her possible answers in advance. He had built a sequence that would make each of those answers irrelevant before she finished speaking. Not because he was trying to humiliate her, but because the numbers made every possible defense mathematically impossible. Pam Bondi had been sitting in that chair for hours. She had answered questions about the Epstein files. She had deflected questions about Trump donations. She had survived every exchange with her usual posture, chin up, shoulders back, the look of someone who has done this 100 times and knows how to run out the clock. She was not prepared for what Massie brought with him. The first 2 hours of the hearing had been standard procedure. Budget allocations, civil rights enforcement, prosecutorial priorities. Bondi had handled each question the same way she always does. Give a partial answer, pivot to a policy statement, run out the 5-minute clock. By the time her third lawyer leaned back in his chair and loosened his collar, it looked like she might get through the day without a single serious problem. Then the chairman called on Thomas Massie. The room shifted, not loudly, but the people who had been watching dozens of these hearings recognised something in the way Massie organised his papers. Methodical, unhurried, the way someone moves when they know the outcome and are simply executing a sequence they have rehearsed in their head 100 times. He didn't attack her, he didn't raise his voice, he didn't accuse her of anything, he just opened his file and started reading numbers. Miss Bondi, he said, I want to read you some figures from your time as Florida's Attorney General. Please listen carefully. The Florida Department of Justice budget year by year. 2011, $1.2 billion. 2012, $1.3 billion. 2013, $1.3 billion. Each number landed in the room like a stone. 2014, $1.4 billion. 2015, $1.5 billion. He kept going. 8 years of budgets, one after another. Total, $12.3 billion. He looked at Bondi. Is that correct? Bondi leaned forward. Generally correct. Massie nodded. He opened another page. Now let me read you the expenses, personnel, equipment, operations. He entered each number into the calculator live in front of everyone. The total came to $12.3 billion. He looked at Bondi again. Budget balanced, correct? Yes, Bondi said. The budget was balanced. Massie paused. Good, but I have one more question. He opened a third page. The Florida Department of Justice Special Victims Fund. You know what that is? Under Florida law, fines from certain cases go into a dedicated fund for crime victims. Between 2011 and 2019, how much money came into that fund? Bondi thought for a moment. I don't remember the exact figure. Massie replied without blinking. I do. $2.4 billion in 8 years. Bondi nodded. Possible. Not possible, Massie corrected her. Definite. It's in the Florida state records. $2.4 billion went into the Special Victims Fund. He opened another page. And how much was spent from that fund? Bondi tried to answer. Approximately $2 billion. No, Massie cut her off. Not approximately, exactly. $1.553 billion. Victim services, health costs, legal aid, counselling. He typed the number into the calculator. $2.4 billion in, $1.553 billion out. He pressed the button and looked up. The difference is $847 million. The room went quiet. So where is that money, Miss Bondi? Where did $847 million go? Here is what nobody in that room said out loud, but every person understood. The Special Victims Fund is not a discretionary account. It is not a flexible budget line that administrators can redirect according to convenience. It is money collected from convicted criminals and designated by law to go directly to the people those criminals hurt. Trafficking survivors, assault victims, families of homicide victims, people who filed claims, waited years, and were told the system would eventually make them whole. That is whose money was missing, not an abstract figure on a spreadsheet. Money that belonged to specific people with names and case numbers and documented injuries. Bondi's expression shifted, not dramatically, but it shifted. She looked at her lawyer. The lawyer leaned in and whispered something. Bondi turned back to the microphone. In the Florida budget system, some funds carry a balance. An $847 million balance in 8 years, Massie interrupted. Is that logical? Bondi started to answer again. Massie raised one hand. He reached into his pocket. He placed his phone on the table. He opened the stopwatch app. Everyone in the room could see the screen. Now I am starting the timer, he said. I will wait until you answer. The stopwatch started. The room was completely still. Journalists stopped typing. Committee members stopped moving. The cameras stayed on Bondi. She had clasped her hands on the table, thumbs pressed together, a gesture she makes when the pressure becomes unbearable. Massie did not move. He learned at MYT that silence is a weapon. If you stay quiet, the other side feels compelled to speak. And if they don't speak, the pressure only grows. Bondi whispered to her lawyer again. The lawyer showed her a document. She shook her head. She did not lean into the microphone. To understand what Bondi's lawyers were actually doing during those seconds, you have to understand the position they were in. They could not answer for her. They could not object to an arithmetic question. They could not claim executive privilege over publicly filed state budget reports. The documents Massie was holding were not classified. They were not sealed. They were Florida state records that any citizen could request. The lawyers had no procedural move available. They could only watch and hope Bondi found something to say that would not make the situation worse. She did not find it. The chairman tried to intervene. Congressman Massie, perhaps. Massie raised his hand. I will wait. A question was asked. An answer should be given. The chairman went silent. The stopwatch kept running. At this point, 3 things were happening simultaneously in that room. The cameras were recording every second of Bondi's face. The journalists in the back row were typing descriptions of her body language into their phones in real time. And at least 2 other committee members were exchanging glances with each other because they recognised what was happening. They had seen hostile hearings before. They had seen witnesses deflect and stonewall and run out the clock. But they had never seen a witness simply unable to answer a math problem about her own department's finances. Bondi lifted her head. She opened her mouth. No words came. She drank from her water glass. The glass trembled slightly in her hand. Every camera caught it. 1 full minute. Massie held the stopwatch up so the room could see it. The numbers kept climbing. Bondi finally leaned into the microphone. There are details in the Florida budget reports. Which detail? Massie asked immediately. Which line shows $847 million? Bondi could not answer. The stopwatch kept running, and then Massie stopped it. He held it up. He showed the number to the room. 65 seconds. He set it down on the table. 65 seconds of silence recorded on camera in front of Congress, in front of the country. But Massie was not finished. He reached into the thick file and pulled out one final document. Miss Bondi, he said, this is the Florida Auditor General's report from 2020, 1 year after you left office. 157 pages. The title, Special Victims Fund Lost Money Analysis. He opened the first page and read the summary aloud. The Florida Department of Justice Special Victims Fund shows a discrepancy of $847 million for the period 2011 to 2019. This amount was not found in the accounts. Transfer records are incomplete. Explanations are insufficient. Risk of possible corruption is high. The room did not react loudly. It absorbed the words in silence, which was somehow worse than noise. Massie continued. The audit office conducted an 18-month investigation. They reviewed 234 documents, they interviewed 47 people, and they reached 4 possible conclusions about where the money went. He read each one. Possibility 1. Unauthorized transfer to the general fund, estimated at $312 million. No transfer document, no signature, no approval. Possibility 2. Referral to other departments, estimated at $198 million. No receiving record at any department. Possibility 3. Payment to external organizations, estimated at $267 million. No invoice, no contract, no proof of service. Possibility 4. Simply lost, the remaining $70 million. No trace at all. Massie typed each number into the calculator. He looked up. $847 million exact. Every single possibility leads back to the same number, and none of them have a single document to explain it. He set the calculator down. He looked directly at Bondi. Miss Bondi, you were the Attorney General of Florida. The Justice Department was your department. The Special Victims Fund was under your responsibility, and $847 million went missing on your watch. Bondi tried to respond. I was not directly responsible for every budget line. You were the Florida Attorney General. Massie cut her off. That is your department. That is your fund. That is your name on the door for 8 years. And the audit report says $847 million is gone. He stood up slightly from his chair. I am an engineer. I build things with numbers. I came here today with a simple question. $2.4 billion came in. $1.553 billion went out. Where is the $847 million? You were silent for 65 seconds. Then you gave me a general answer with no figures, and a 157-page audit report says the money is missing, unauthorized, undocumented, and unrecovered. He gathered the documents back into his file. Those records will be entered into the congressional record today. Every figure, every audit finding, every line of that report. He looked at Bondi one final time. The stopwatch doesn't lie, the auditor doesn't lie, and the $847 million didn't disappear by accident. 65 seconds of silence. That is the only answer Pam Bondi gave, and the country saw every second of it. Now here is the question nobody in that room asked out loud, but every person walked out thinking. The audit report was completed in 2020, 1 year after Bondi left office, which means someone commissioned that investigation. Someone inside the Florida state government believed the discrepancy was large enough and suspicious enough to justify 18 months of work, 234 documents, and 47 interviews. And after all of that work, the conclusion was not that the money had been misclassified. It was not that the money had been transferred under an obscure statute. The conclusion was, we cannot find it, we cannot trace it, we cannot explain it. That report existed before today's hearing. It had been sitting in the Florida State Archives for 4 years. Massie found it. Bondi apparently did not know he had it. Or if she did know, she had no prepared response ready, because there is no prepared response to arithmetic. You either know where $847 million went, or you do not. And in 65 seconds in front of Congress, Pam Bondi demonstrated that she did not know or could not say. Those are very different problems, and right now, nobody is sure which one it is. What happened after Massie stepped away from the microphone is worth understanding. The hearing continued. Other members asked other questions. Antitrust policy, immigration enforcement, the standard agenda items that had been scheduled for weeks. Bondi answered them in the same measured tone she had used for the first 2 hours. But the room was not the same room it had been 20 minutes earlier. The journalists in the back were not writing about antitrust policy. 3 of Bondi's lawyers were grouped together near the wall, talking quietly while looking at their phones. Not the casual phone checking of people waiting for the next question, but the focused, rapid kind of communication that happens when a legal team is trying to calculate the damage and determine whether a public statement needs to go out before the day is over. By the time the hearing formally adjourned, 2 things had already happened outside that room. Legal analysts watching the live feed had begun comparing the 65-second stopwatch moment to other significant congressional testimony, not because of the silence alone, but because of what the silence represented. A former state attorney general, now the sitting United States Attorney General, unable to account for $847 million that moved through a fund specifically designated to protect crime victims, and Florida advocacy groups representing trafficking and assault survivors had already issued a statement. 3 paragraphs. The last one contained a single question. If the money was there and it was not spent on victims, then where did it go, and who received it? That question is now part of the congressional record. The audit report is now part of the congressional record. The stopwatch footage is already in the hands of every major news organisation that had a camera in that room. Massie entered his district carrying a calculator and a 157-page audit report that most people in Washington had never read. He left that room having done something that hours of testimony, political accusations, and procedural manoeuvring had failed to do. He made the money visible. $847 million. No documents, no signatures, no approvals, no invoices, no contracts, and 65 seconds where the Attorney General of the United States had nothing to say. The numbers are in the record now. And now the political consequences are beginning to unfold. Within hours of the hearing ending, clips of the 65-second silence were circulating across every major platform. Not edited highlights, not commentary, just the raw footage. Massie standing still beside the glowing stopwatch. Bondi staring forward. No answer. In Washington, silence can sometimes be more damaging than an admission, because silence leaves a vacuum, and vacuums get filled by speculation. Reporters began requesting copies of the audit report. Legal commentators started reviewing Florida budget procedures live on television. Former prosecutors were asked the same question repeatedly. If $847 million cannot be accounted for in a legally protected victims fund, what happens next? Behind closed doors, staff members from multiple congressional offices reportedly began contacting the Florida Auditor General's office to verify the document trail Massie referenced during the hearing. Not because the numbers sounded unbelievable, but because they sounded precise. Precise numbers are dangerous in politics. Broad accusations can be dismissed as partisan theatre, but line items, audit summaries, transfer gaps, and unreconciled balances create a different kind of pressure. They create a paper trail. And once a paper trail enters the congressional record, it no longer belongs only to the hearing room. It becomes public property. Analysts, investigators, journalists, and watchdog groups can all follow it independently. That is what made the moment so unsettling for the people watching closely. Massie never made a dramatic accusation. He never claimed criminal intent. He never raised his voice or delivered a speech designed for applause. Instead, he did something far more difficult to counter. He reduced the entire issue to subtraction. Money entered a fund, less money came out. The remaining balance could not be fully explained. Everything else in the hearing became secondary to that equation. Even Bondi's defenders struggled to shift the conversation away from it, because every attempt eventually circled back to the same question: where did the money go? Inside the Capitol, lawmakers from both parties were careful with their public statements. Some avoided commenting entirely. Others emphasized that an audit discrepancy does not automatically prove criminal conduct. But even those statements carried an unspoken acknowledgement that the discrepancy itself was now impossible to ignore. The hearing had transformed a technical financial issue buried in state records into a national political story. And it happened because one congressman walked into a hearing with a calculator, a stack of public documents, and enough preparation to force a room full of experienced politicians into complete silence. For Massie, the strategy was deliberate from the beginning. He understands that complicated scandals often survive because they remain complicated. The average person does not read 157-page audit reports. They do not study state financial ledgers or compare budget allocations across 8 fiscal years. Most people tune out when government language becomes technical. Massie simplified the issue into something anyone watching could understand in seconds. $2.4 billion came in. $1.553 billion went out. Where is the $847 million? That single line carried more weight than hours of political rhetoric, because it required no interpretation. And for Bondi, the damage may not come from what was proven in that hearing, but from what was left unanswered. Public perception is often shaped less by accusations than by reactions. People remember hesitation. They remember visible discomfort. They remember the trembling water glass and the stopwatch counting upward while the room waited. Those images stay in the public mind far longer than legal explanations released days later through official statements or press offices. The larger issue now is whether the hearing triggers further investigation. Congressional hearings alone do not determine guilt, and audit findings do not automatically establish corruption. But hearings can create momentum. They can pressure agencies to reopen reviews, encourage journalists to dig deeper, and push watchdog organizations to demand additional records. Once attention shifts toward financial discrepancies involving victim compensation funds, every unexplained transfer and missing document receives far more scrutiny than it did before. As the cameras shut off and the hearing room finally emptied, one detail remained impossible to overlook. Massie had entered the room carrying ordinary public records, documents that had technically been available for years. Nothing he used was classified. Nothing was leaked anonymously.